What is up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the OTK podcast. My name is Caleb. I am your host. And since it is an even-numbered episode, that means we're talking about something having to do with faith in the church. And I'm super excited about my guest today, Pastor Mark Francey. Thank you so much for being here.
Honored to be with you today.
So we're going to jump into a couple of things. We're going to talk about your church plant. We're going to talk about church culture and some things I'm excited to dig in with you. But first, I want to have a little bit of fun. I showed you an Instagram pic. We're going to throw it up here. For those that are listening on
it's a great first impression.
For those listening on iTunes, can you describe what is happening in this picture and why it is one that instantly stuck out to me as I was scrolling through your feed?
It was a Halloween little time of the year. Halloween time of the year. My cousin Shane Grove actually sewed together a T-shirt, filled it full of cotton balls, so it added about 300 pounds to my life. And he got me a wig, and we just thought it'd be pretty funny to get together. We both had our fat suits on, and we went to a local Walmart and just tried to contribute to the flavor of our local store.
I'm going to guess you didn't add too much flavor. I've been to Walmart after like 7 o'clock at any given time.
I hear the only thing that Walmart doesn't have is an observation deck.
Have you ever seen the website peopleofwalmart.com?
I've seen that. That's kind of what inspired that outfit for sure.
Well, it is by far it makes me question, like, am I really that great of a Christian? Because I laugh a little too hard at those kinds of things. But I didn't think it was fat. When I looked at the picture, I thought it was like a muscle suit. So it made me think maybe I need to go get myself one of these.
No, you're in good shape. You're in good shape.
Bulkier. But congratulations on that being like the most scandalous Instagram photo that you got. But I just
appreciate that first impression for our audience here.
And the other thing that I noticed when I was scrolling in your bio, it mentioned that you were a connoisseur of chips and salsa.
I do. So I do love chips and salsa.
We're going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
I need to know all the places you traveled, all the places you've been, greatest chips and salsa in the United States or worldwide if you've gone to that.
That's a great question. You know, it's interesting. I find that sometimes the kind of hole-in-the-wall Mexican restaurants have some of the best salsa that you can actually get. One of my favorites here in California, Las Vegas, is a restaurant called Javier's, and they have really, really excellent salsa for sure.
Interesting. So when your church plant blows up and you become the biggest church, you're going to release your own salsa, I'm sure.
That would be great. An Ocean's Church salsa.
Just it sounds like right in the front of it.
It sounds like a moneymaker to me for sure.
No, that's I do not like salsa. I love chips.
Okay.
My parents literally had salt and pepper in our house. That was the only spices. So I didn't have Mexican food until I married my wife, who's half Vietnamese and half Mexican, and so then there was lots of it everywhere, and my stomach does not know how to handle it. So I'm going to take your word on it. I'm not going to go try the chips and salsa, but I got one funny, lighthearted question before we dive in. The name of your church plant is?
Ocean's Church.
So tell me, please, that you played Oceans on your launch day.
You know, I want to thank Hillsong for writing the song for us. And no, you know what's funny is I actually had that question a few times, and we did not actually sing Ocean's Church week 1, but it's one of my favorite songs. So I'm sure we will play it at some point. We're only 3 weeks into this journey, so I'm sure at some point we're going to introduce it to Ocean's Church.
So just to fill everybody in on the church plant and where you're at and everything that you're doing, just tell us a little bit about what you got going on.
Well, basically, I spent the last 16 years in Boise, Idaho. My wife, Rochelle, and I were youth and young adult pastors at a great church called Capital Church right outside of Boise, Idaho. And I actually married the pastor's daughter, which is good job security when you work on staff at the church. And we've been leading there the last 16 years, and just May of this year, we moved to Orange County, South Orange County, California. My family is originally from Los Angeles area, so I spent the first 18 years in California, the last 16 in Boise, and God has a sense of humor, kind of brought it full circle and brought us down here to South Orange County.
So I'm sure this isn't going to be the first time you've heard this, but what was your motivation in planting a church in what, as far as the state, maybe not we can get into the specific demographics of where you're planting. But as far as California, it's one of the most liberal states in the country, especially in the LA area. So, what were your thoughts going into it? How does that change kind of how you do ministry or considering the demographics? Does that change the way that you approach issues? Does it change the way that, the way that you talk about things or address? What's your thought on the demographics?
It's interesting because we were, like I said, from Boise. We like to consider ourselves Northwest.
Right.
I don't know if Seattle and Portland would include us, but we consider ourselves Northwest people. And I think as a general rule, the West Coast is definitely more of a harder demographic to reach, especially for churches and audiences. A lot more skeptical audience, and you don't have that built-in culture like the South that everyone just goes to church regardless if they know God, love God or not.
Right.
It's what we do on Sundays. It's not like that in California as a whole. Certainly not like that on the West Coast, Northwest. And so I think the last 16 years was great preparation for us. Being in a place, Boise is predominantly a lot of LDS. So a lot of people go to church, but just different type of church.
Right, for sure.
And so, but then you have a large demographic in Boise that are just anti-God, anti-Christianity. And so I felt like that was really great preparation for us coming back down to California, a pretty hostile environment.
Yeah.
But I would say, just being honest, that Orange County would probably be a softer part of the state as compared to if you were in Los Angeles, San Francisco, other cities.
So in your experience, because I feel like so many people misunderstand what's going on as far as people that don't consider themselves Christians. A lot of people think that it's an issue of the unchurched, when in reality it's mostly an issue of the post-church. Do you find obviously if you're going to find an area that has people that are unchurched, that just have never, this is going to be the area because there's just more of that culture. Do you find most of the people that you're trying to pull in are post-church, or they've just never had that experience at all? It was never an important part of their, growing up and those in the culture, or which one do you find is your more common?
It's literally probably a 50-50 split. That you either talk to someone in Orange County that says they go to one of the large mega churches here, but if you start exploring that, it's for Christmas and Easter.
Right.
And that is their commitment to the local church. And the other 50% would be, no, I've never been to church, I don't go to church, I'm hostile towards church. And the moment you say you're a pastor, it kind of turns into this awkward dynamic that
for sure.
I got to prove to this person that I'm not a weirdo or a hate monger. So it's kind of an interesting spread for sure.
So what is how have you seen kind of that culture change in the fact that I feel like in the last 2 years things have become that much more polarized? Do you find as kind of the nation separates that it pulls people into, searching for answers, and the fact that they see all of the things going on and they think, I want a better, stronger foundation than what I feel right now? Or do you feel like people are seeing the turmoil and becoming more tribal and therefore harder to get into church?
Man, I think that's a great question. And I don't know if I have a clear-cut answer for that. I think what I've experienced personally, I think that what's been is what's going to continue to be. But I think what really makes things different nowadays is just you have more of an opportunity to share your opinion, whether you're one side or the other, because of social media. So I think it has in some ways polarized the differences between non-church, pro-church or anti-church. It's just a lot easier to see both sides of it. And I think that you see a lot more aggression. For people that love God, you see a lot more of that on social media. Yeah. And people that hate God, you see a lot more of that on social media. And there's not a whole lot of middle ground.
Yeah, there's virtually no middle ground anymore, which is why we do a lot of what we do, trying to find that position of not rejecting the intellectual demographic, and just pushing that faith. So let me ask you this. When it comes to being creative in reaching a people group that because traditionally, we talk about how unchurched California is as a whole, right?
Sure.
But I think a lot of it is not about the number of churches that have tried to be planted. It's more about the number of ones that have been successful. Is that a fair analysis?
I would say that's pretty fair, yeah.
So what do you think most of the people that have tried and failed, like what is the key factor if somebody is going to church or plant a church in a unchurched, because it's not just California, Seattle, I mean, there's plenty of places that are more post or unchurched. What's that dynamic that you find that really ties in? Because I know there's a lot of buzzwords about being culturally relevant and all of these things, and everybody has their own opinion about what makes it successful in a hostile, people group. But what's the thing that really stuck out to you and said, this is the one thing that I want to make sure we get right?
That's a great question, too. Caleb, I think honestly, man, I don't even think I'm qualified to answer what constitutes failing and succeeding. We're only 3 weeks into this journey, so I'm sure
you're not an expert yet.
I'm not quite an expert after 3 weeks into this thing, but I would say, I think that God calls different types of people to reach different type of cities and people groups, and I think that from what I've seen, just studying kind of the church at large, is that the pastors that seem to be the most effective are the ones that kind of fit the aesthetic and the demographic of where they're pastoring.
Yeah.
And so I think, and that's not always I think God can call you anywhere, but it does seem like when a pastor's grace, gift, skill, personality, just their demeanor, when that matches the area that they're in. Rick Warren, who's a legend here in California, he always talks about that the easiest demographic to reach is the demographic that you are. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes maybe churches have a hard time because you go to an area that really isn't like who you are. And so that would be my 2 cents on it, but I would say that there's a lot of other people that would be a lot more qualified to answer that than myself.
Well, that's a good, humble answer. You can't ever go wrong with the ask somebody else, So you were talking a little bit about social media, and I feel like that has become such a integral part of what we do as people of faith. The idea, when you look at the fact that 30 years ago youth ministry barely existed, college ministries barely existed, and now there's kind of this emerging market of churches having to weigh okay, what role is social media going to play in how we do ministry and all of these things. And as somebody that has a good sized following, on Instagram and those kinds of things, the 20,000 followers or something crazy, what is your thoughts on the fact that there are so many pastors now that have more influence with people that will never step through their doors, right? Because you'll probably never have 20,000 people sitting in a seat on Sunday morning, but obviously that many people have identified with your mission, with your approach, with whatever it is you personally. What are your thoughts on an emerging ministry style that is reaching out far past what you could physically touch or the needs that you could physically meet? And now it's about influencing culture, it's about influencing people, shaping mindsets of individuals you may never get to shake the hand of.
I think it's a great question, Caleb. I think social media and following, I think it's always dangerous to make broad statements.
For sure.
All blondes are this, all brunettes are that, all hamburger joints are like this, all potatoes are like. I just think that whenever you make a broad statement, there's usually a lot of ignorance laced in that. I think we have to be honest in the fact that if the Bible was being written today, I think that King David would have had a lot of followers. If the Bible was being written today, I think that Solomon would have had a lot of followers.
Yeah.
And if you kind of go through the narrative, the Apostle Paul would have had a large following. And so I'm not trying in any way to equate them to us.
No, I understand, yeah.
But I do think that it's ignorant for us to say, well, because you have a large following, you must be doing something wrong. I think that's rooted in insecurity.
Oh, for
I
sure.
think that's rooted in jealousy. And I think that that's never probably a wise way to go about it. I heard a great pastor say that, I always want to walk softly about judging other people, and I don't ever want to criticize something that God is blessing.
Yeah.
And God's pretty good at elevating the people that he wants to be elevated. I've met a lot of great pastors, 10, 15 years ago before no one knew who they were. And I could honestly, if I was a betting man, I'm not, but if I was, I would have bet on some of these guys and said, God's going to elevate this guy. This guy probably will have a television show one day. God probably will give this guy a national audience. Yeah. And it's because there was something of quality that touched the heart of God that he wanted to elevate. And so I just think that we got to be careful of making judgments on people just because they have large followings, just because they're influencing people that maybe you don't like or you have judgmental issues with.
Right.
I think that it takes all types of pastors to lead, to reach and to lead all different types of people. And so I just think we have to celebrate better. And I think that's what we don't do a good job of.
No, that's good. That's good. So what advice would you have, as somebody that has kind of tasted some of that success in that area, what advice would you give to young pastors? Because I feel like this is such a brand new struggle, you know what I mean? In the fact that there are so many topics that you can go to an older, more wiser senior pastor and say, hey, this is something, whatever. But there's so many guys that couldn't even relate to the issue of getting addicted to wanting to scroll over and look at your Instagram likes or whatever. If there's somebody that is going through that process, what advice would you give to them to try to, and not just pastors, I think there's going to be a huge wave of content creators in the Christian world as a whole in the next 15 years. I think you're going to have a lot of YouTubers that have millions of followers that are putting out godly, sound content. So what advice would you give to those people on how to stay grounded, how to stay, feeling like no matter how big my following gets, I have one mission, I have one audience?
Absolutely.
What would you say?
Again, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer it, but I would say, Caleb, I think keeping the main thing is a professional athlete is someone that's mastered the basics. Yeah. Great basketball players are really good dribblers. They're really good passers. Well, not in the NBA, but most of the other great basketball players, they've mastered the fundamentals. And I think that a lot of these guys that God has elevated, they just got into it for the right reasons, and they mastered the fundamentals. I think that what social media does is it shows the outcomes of their fundamental walk with God. And I think that what it's doing is it's almost like going to a great restaurant and you get to eat this amazing dish, and you get to be in an amazing atmosphere and environment and community, but you don't realize that there was a kitchen that no one saw, and there was people working in there that no one witnessed, that actually put in sweat and effort and tears, and there was a lot of things that happened behind the scenes that people on a Sunday morning aren't seeing. And so I think some of your favorite preachers and pastors and leaders in the church world, they spent seasons of their life that no one saw, and they think that they wanted to become famous, or they thought they wanted to become influential, but that wasn't the case. They just wanted to be faithful in the kitchen. And I think that God is honored and God has elevated some of the dishes that they've prepared through the years of preparation and just following after Jesus. And so I think that social media is good at capturing outcomes. And I think if you're a young listener watching or listening today, I would just encourage you, don't get obsessed with what the dish is like in the restaurant. Fall in love with the chef that's in the kitchen.
That's good.
And I think if you can do that, you're going to be in a healthy place. Because the goal isn't to be famous, the goal is to be faithful.
That's good.
And I think our generation has to learn that. You know, I read a survey that said that nowadays, when I was growing up, people wanted to be firemen, police officers, they wanted to be teachers, educators, lawyers. And I read a survey just recently that said that most kids that are polled nowadays, they want to be famous when they get older. And I think there is a fame hunger in our generation. And I just think if I could say anything to younger people is I would say desire to be faithful, not famous. And if God gives you influence, praise God. But I think that just influence by itself will never satisfy you. I've learned that means can never give you meaning, only express meaning. And I think that some people think if they had more money or more influence or more notoriety, that would give them meaning. Means don't ever give meaning. Only God can give meaning to life.
No, that's great. And one thing that I always say is, whether it's influence or it's money or it's recognition, I think a lot of times people think that those things change you. But in most of my experience, I think it more reveals who you were before. It just makes you more of whatever that was. So, from what I'm getting, you would say try to work on what you make sure that what you are right now is solid. That way, when you become more of whatever that is through influence, through following, through all of these things, that it's something productive. And
I'd even add to that too. One of the conversations I have with a lot of young youth pastors, been able to just encourage a lot of guys that are getting into it or just kind of new to youth ministry, is I think with the technology era, there's so many great teachings and podcasts. We even talked about that before the interview. There's so much availability to knowledge that it's so easy to actually just hijack other people's thoughts and hijack other people's really the moments they had with God. And what we're doing is we're almost regurgitating nourishment that someone else digested. And I think that would be one of my major concerns, I think, with the younger generation, with podcast and technology. Jesus said man does not live by podcast alone. He didn't say that. But I do think there's a lot of guys that if we're not careful, all we'll do is we'll actually just transfer water from other people's wells.
That's awesome.
And I think that if I could say anything as an older brother, is I would say dig your own well. Spend time with Jesus for yourself. And again, I'm not spending time with God so I can look good in front of people. I'm spending time with God because I love God. God is the reward. His presence is the reward. And I think that if we can get in that mindset that I'm spending time with God, I'm digging a well. I just think if you're listening to this and the only time you communicate or the only messages you share are messages you're regurgitating from somebody else, and I've learned from this from experience. The early days of my ministry, I'd be so inspired by other people that I would copy more than I would actually let spend time and let God do something inside of me. But I'm just telling you that if all you do is transfer water, eventually that'll burn you out. You got to learn to dig your own well and have your own source.
Well, I think that's so true in the fact that it kind of cheapens the gifts that you've been given. Because, I'll listen to Andy Stanley speak about his role in things, and he even says, he's like, I got to the point where I realized people weren't coming to my church because I was their senior pastor. They were coming because I was good at communicating. And so I transferred responsibilities to a lot of other guys as far as the traditional stuff. And now I'm a communicator. But there's so many pastors that will never be the type of communicator that warrants giving away so I think a lot of times you're absolutely right in the fact that it cheapens when you don't take the time to find out what your thing is. If you're always looking, and I know I was guilty of that early on in youth ministry. I watched a lot of Mark Driscoll stuff, and he was, intense and in your face and yelling, and that connected with me because, if there's one thing I don't like in a sermon, personally, it's, if it's too fluffy, if it's too nice, it doesn't connect with my personality type. I'm very direct, very in your face. And so, I know I got myself into trouble as a young youth pastor trying to model a lot of that same thing. And while it's interesting because those kinds of preaching styles feed me, but that's not what I'm good at. When you look, I am really good at sitting down and having that conversation of how can I help you come to whatever I think is best for you in the most compassionate, reasonable, and logical way possible, which is not at all the style that he had when I was listening. It was, I'm going to take the truth, I'm going to beat you over the head with it. And that's what I needed because I was thick-headed and I needed somebody to beat me with it. But a lot of the world isn't that way. And I wasn't good at delivering truth that way. I just came across abrasive and nobody wanted to listen to me. So, you know what I mean? So I think you're absolutely right in the fact that it's one of those things where you need to find your own thing because God created you uniquely. And that's a big part of who you are. So I got one last two-part question, and we'll be good to go here. What is one thing that excites you most about church culture, and one thing that you think, and it doesn't just have to be, when I say church culture, I don't just mean what happens in the four walls, but maybe more on whether it's Christian content, music, movies, or anything in the sphere of faith. What's something that excites you, and one thing that kind of makes you stand back on your toes a little bit and say, maybe we need to be careful about how we go about this?
I love that question. I'm excited, Caleb, because I think that if you would have told me 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that some of the greatest music, that we'd have Christian songs that are awesome to listen to.
Just as good, if not better.
Just as good, if not better.
Yeah.
And they're on the top of iTunes. And there's an audience that's not just in some local church, in some small town somewhere, but literally some of the greatest churches in the world are influencing some of the greatest cities in the world. If you'd have told me that it wasn't just something that was going to happen far off somewhere else on a small scale, but that we would actually make movies and entertain entertainers and influence some of the greatest influencers on the earth. If you'd have told me that 20 years ago, I don't think I would have believed you. And so I think that we're living in right now an era of prayers that we prayed 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago. I'm excited about how technology can take our message to places that it's never been taken to. And I'm so excited about that. I think my concern moving forward would just be, I think that our greatest gift right now is technology in some ways to get our message out. But I think that that's also simultaneously probably our greatest weakness right now, that we got to learn to leverage technology, not to divide people, but to unite people. John 13, Jesus says that the world will know that you're my followers by the way you love people. And I would just, I think if I could say anything, let's not sacrifice the audience of the world that Jesus died for by topics and issues that are temporary at the expense of our message that's eternal. I heard Billy Graham at one of the last interviews of his life. Billy Graham was asked a question that really stuck with me. The interviewer said, if you had to do life over again, what would be one of the major things that you would do differently? And Billy Graham, America's hero, he sat there and kind of paused and he said, what I would have done? And I'm paraphrasing, but he essentially said, I wouldn't have divided the audience that I had over temporary issues at the expense of my eternal values. And I think that my takeaway from his interview as he answered this interviewer is he said, essentially, I don't want to forfeit, because I think sometimes some issues in the body of Christ right now are so hot, they're so divisive in nature. I'm not saying we can't have intellectual conversations.
Right.
I don't even think we have to amputate our brains to be Christians. I think that we can think, but I do think there's a level of wisdom that we have to have as leaders, as pastors, as influencers, that we address issues, but at the same time, we use our social media, our platforms, our podiums, or whatever we're using to unite people and not divide people. And I guess for me, what I've personally, and I'll close like this, is For me, I don't ever want to make a comment or a remark that can sacrifice 50% of my audience.
Yeah.
I think that the wisdom is, let's love everybody. Let's know what we believe. Let's even know why we believe it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important because I think the moment we say certain statements, we post certain pictures, and we even we activate certain conversations. I think it's really, really easy to shut down 50% of your audience. So I'm not saying we don't have conversation. I just think I love what you're doing. That we have to bring it in a middle space.
Yeah.
That we say, look, we're full of grace, but we're also full of truth. And it just bothers me at times when sometimes we're more passionate about our political party than we are about our Savior.
That's good.
And I always want to make sure that my message of Jesus is more important than who I'm voting for, more important than what rally I went to. I think we got to keep the main thing. So if I could just, one area of concern is let's keep the majors. No,
that's great. And I think, you mentioned an issue being hot. And I think one thing that I try to always encourage people is if you think an issue is hot, right? What do you do with an item that is hot? If someone's coming out of the oven, you don't stick your hand in. You stop and you think. You say, okay, this could cause damage.
Absolutely.
If I don't handle this the right way, if I don't have the right gloves on,
great thought.
If I don't know, okay, when I grab this, where am I going to place it?
Yeah.
Because if I put it down in an environment that it's not ready for, if it's not prepped for, this is going to be a bad result. It could cause a fire and do a lot more damage than whatever the benefit of cooking that item could have ever been to me. So I think your comments are right on the nose. Because I got a lot of flack when during the election I posted something about the fact like, hey, remember your loyalty is to the kingdom, not a party. And there were a lot of people that didn't sit well with. But I think the difference between somebody being successful in the kinds of things that you're doing, or even the things that I'm doing, is being able to say like, okay, is this a make or break thing?
Totally.
Because if it's not, if this isn't something that I think Jesus would get upset about, then there's no reason for me to be upset about it. Even if it's a personal pet peeve of mine, that I want to get annoyed about whatever it is. If it's not something that is speaking light into darkness, if this isn't a good versus evil kind of thing, I need to be careful about the things that I'm saying.
Absolutely.
But before we go, I want to give a shameless plug for anybody in the area that is interested in checking out your church, or maybe they don't live in the area, but they love what you had to say and kind of what you're trying to accomplish, and may want to give to the church or anything like that. Give us your information.
Sure. We're in South Orange County right now. We're right on the border of Mission Viejo and Laguna Niguel. It's Oceans Church. Our website is theoceanschurch.com. And essentially, we want to be a church that has a shallow end and a deep end, a church that you're excited to bring your friends that don't know Jesus to come check it out, but also be a church that's not just shallow, that we actually believe in the power of God, the presence of God, and really be a church that non-church people would enjoy going to. So we're excited. We're a brand new community. Our desire is to have a major Oceans Church campus at every major ocean in the world one day. And we believe that God's going to continue to bring in the people, bring in the resources. And if you are in Orange County, California, close to Orange County, we would love to have you come check us out. Right now, currently, we are meeting at Capistrano Valley's Performing Arts Theater. And so if you want to come be our guest every Sunday at 10:30, again, our website is theoceanschurch.com, and our IG handle is @OceansChurch.
Okay, and I will make sure to include all that in the link down below. So if you're watching this a month from now, a year from now, 20 years from now, you can go back and check and see all their campuses 20 years from now, all the incredible things that God is doing. Thank you, Pastor Mark, so much for coming on the program, talking with us. It was great to meet you.
My honor, Caleb. Thanks so much for having me.
Bye.